When Cascadia Daily News launched more than 3 years ago, we knew we wouldn't succeed without the partnership of you, the public. When you subscribe to CDN, and when you attend events like this, you, like our owner, David Syrie, are making an investment in local journalism. And there's never been a more crucial time to make that investment. When local journalism disappears, as it has in many parts of the country, democracy begins to die. Because democracy depends on an informed electorate. Next month, on April 25th, you'll have another chance to make an investment in local journalism. We'll be celebrating our first 3 years, and just as importantly, celebrating the community we serve and live in, with a fundraising event to support some important local journalism initiatives, including a new emphasis on covering hospitals and healthcare in our region. There will be more information on this event in our newsletters and on cascadiadaily.com shortly, but hold that date, April 25th, for another chance to invest in local journalism. We first began talking last fall about having a border program as one of our series of forums. After all, the border has played and continues to play an historic and vastly important role in the life of the Cascadia region. After the election and inauguration of Donald Trump, the issue took on new urgency, and we decided to put together a program about how the new administration's actions and rhetoric impact the border region, and most importantly, the people who live and work here. And what a series of actions the administration has taken in its first 70 or so days. Tariffs, on again, off again, on again, off again, on again, and so on, including stiff tariffs against Canada, our good neighbor whose people in the lower mainland contribute significantly to Whatcom County's economy. And the president has even mused that Canada should become the 51st state. Canada has responded with tariffs of its own, and Canadians at large have responded by boycotting US products and/or forsaking trips to the United States. Hockey fans have been booing the US national anthem. We've already seen anecdotal evidence of declining southbound border traffic, and this is being felt by businesses in Whatcom County. Deportations and the fear of deportations have affected agriculture, education, and law enforcement in our region, not to mention the cost in lives disrupted. And now the administration seems determined to either ignore or defy court orders. We have quite a distinguished panel to discuss this issue tonight. And to lead that discussion, we have an experienced journalist who's lived in Cascadia for decades, and who many of you know as a longtime columnist for the Seattle Times. More recently, we know him as the founding executive editor of Cascadia Daily News. Please welcome my colleague, Ron Judd. And joining us on the panel is the man who was elected the first new sheriff in Whatcom County in 20 years. Before that, he was a police chief in the border community of Blaine and was deputy chief at Western Washington University, where I met and worked with him. Please welcome Sheriff Donnell Tanksley. As I said, the new administration has had a major impact on the immigrant community here in our border region. We're pleased to have with us tonight a man who has been on the front lines of that situation. He's an attorney in the Impact Litigation Unit at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, and he's a native of Linden. Please welcome Aaron Korthuis. Our final two panelists are experts on Canadian-American relations and policy. Laurie Trautman is the director of Western's Border Policy Research Institute and the co-author with Edward Alden of the recently published book, When the World Closed Its Doors, The COVID-19 Tragedy and the Future of Borders. I read this book last month, and I can tell you it's an excellent and important read. Please welcome Laurie Trautman. Our next panelist, in addition to being the co-author of When the World Closed Its Doors, is the Ross Distinguished Professor in Business and Economics at Western and a fellow at the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations. He's a widely published journalist and served as the Washington Bureau Chief for the Financial Times. Please welcome Edward Alden. Okay, Ron, over to you.
Thank you, Dean. And I want to say I have a few acknowledgments I'd like to make here for a couple minutes. I'm starting with everybody in this room. Thank you for coming to our event. It's great to see so many faces here, some of which I think I recognize if I can see through the... Seriously, it's very important to us to have such a show of support here. And we started as a news organization, as Dean mentioned, almost 4 years ago as kind of a dream of filling the role of a local daily newspaper in Whatcom County. We had a crew of 9 people, full and part-time back then, and launched in early 2022 with a print edition and daily digital coverage. 3 years later, where we are now, we've grown to, as of this week, 16 people with a coverage area in 2 counties and 360,000 folks. So it's a whole other order of business than what we started with, and we love that. So that's possible because of a lot of people in this room for subscribing with us and buying advertising in Cascadia Daily News. So thank you. From our heart, thank you. I want to thank a few other people before we get started. First, Seaholm High School for putting the hall in our town hall with this wonderful room, which is a really nice place to do this. Our panelists, who are all busy people, for their time. CDN's business staff, a lot of which is here tonight. Our publishers, Cynthia Pope, Lisa McCoy, Taylor Claflin, Alex Riddell, Marina Sanders, and Ryan Marinelli, and especially events coordinator Nina Claflin, who put this event together. And I also want to recognize our newsroom staff, many of which are here, I think. Some of them are out working, but a lot of them are here. And those are reporters Annie Todd, who's covering the event tonight. If you're here and you're on the staff, wave your hand when I say your name. I can't see you. Right over here. Isaac Simonelli, I think, is our photographer tonight, right there, wandering around. Julia Tellman, Sophia Gates, Nick Zeller-Singh, Charlotte Alden, who is not working tonight because she has a conflict of interest that I'd like to explain. I was told backstage that on campus, Ted is known as Charlotte's dad, more so than Ted. So there's a family relationship there, which is nice. And I would like to thank Ted for being around Bellingham to bring Charlotte to Bellingham and to come to our newsroom first as an intern and now as one of our great education reporter. 2 news contributors who contribute a lot of work. You'll recognize their names, Elliot Allman and Frank Catalano is here, I believe. Frank, over there. Thank you. Editors, Rhonda Prass, our managing editor, Audra Anderson, J.F. Flannery, who's running the questions board tonight, reporter, editor, Coco Laney, news producer, Eric Trent, and our visual journalist, Finn Wendt, who's on the video camera back here, Andy Bronson. And we have 2 new special staff members who just started this week. It's a big week for us at CDN. One of whom is Alana Markham. Is Alana here? Over here? Who's our new audience engagement editor. She comes to us from Bowling Green, Kentucky, where she worked at WKU Public Media and was a host for All Things Considered. Our second one is not here tonight because he's right now in Tacoma at a demonstration at the ICE detention facility, oddly enough. And that's visual journalist and reporter Santiago Ochoa, who previously worked as a reporter photographer in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and as a reporter photographer at the Yakima Herald Republic. He joined us on Monday, and he has not had a chance to sit down since he got here. So, and he is sorry he can't be here tonight. But anyway, a big welcome for all those folks and a thanks. you'll be meeting those people around the community because they will be showing up at your events. So again, the timing of this is very, very useful, I think, and a lot of things are going on with the border right now. There's way more that we can cover in 2 hours here, so I'll get right to the point. So maybe an opening question for all you folks on the panel is, clearly your impression about our relationship with our neighbors in Canada has changed a lot in the past maybe 100 days. And I'm curious how that affects your work and your job moving forward into the next year, and what is the one particular thing about this new relationship that keeps you awake at night? Ted, you want to start?
I'm going to start. That's a tough one to start with. I think you can't possibly overstate what a dramatic change this is. I mean, Canada has organized its entire economy around relations with the United States pretty much for 60 years, going back to the Auto Pact of 1965, but very intensively since the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement that was ratified in 1989. And now you've got Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, saying, we can no longer rely on the United States. We have to forge an independent economic future. You put on top of that the annexation threats. There haven't been serious annexation threats from the United States for 150 years. So this is extraordinary, and the Canadians are finding it very threatening. And then we can talk about what's happening at the border, which is a whole other dimension. So this is really transformational stuff, and I fear not for the good, especially for our community here, where the ties across the border are just so important. I think economically, culturally, spiritually, and for me personally, very important with so much family in Canada.
So I run a research institute that studies the Canada-US border, mostly here in this region. I've been doing this for about 11 years, and it was really pretty boring for a while. It was sort of like, okay, things work well, let's make things that work well work better. It was very productive, it was very, very positive, and it was very unpoliticized. And maybe that's almost the biggest shift, building on all of the other things we're seeing, is watching the Canada-US border being turned into a political weapon, and how difficult it is to adjust to that new reality, whether that's the Canadian pushback, that's the lack of travel, or even just like the fundamentally questioning the value of cross-border collaboration, which here in this region has been a part of this sort of Cascadia vision and ethos for decades, and I think that's coming into question as well. So a new reality, sort of a transformation, and just trying to keep up with all of the news of the day and all of the shifts, but also grounding it here in the reality of what we see in Whatcom County is a lot. And unfortunately, most of it is not positive.
So a lot of my work is representing people who are already here in the United States and have been detained and end up at the detention center, or are in removal proceedings at the Seattle Immigration Court, or in some cases have been detained at the southern border and then transferred to the detention center in Tacoma. That said, I think what we're likely to see in terms of relations with Canada and people crossing the border is some of what we saw during the first Trump administration. So there was a lot more, I would say, rigorous screening of people at times at the northern border than is historically the case during the first Trump administration. And I think all indications indicate or suggest that that's going to be true again. So a good example of that is during the first Trump administration, several times there was a bunch of Iranians who were detained and held for hours for effectively no reason. And I think that type of rigorous secondary screening is something that not only people who are Iranian are going to have to face again, but perhaps Canadians too now, to be perfectly honest. The aggression with which we've already seen that at airports and other places, I think is going to probably easily spill over to the Canadian border too. So I think that's something that, in terms of our relations with Canada, is probably Canadians are going to have to expect at this point, to be honest, and perhaps returning American citizens or lawful permanent residents as well who visit Canada.
Well, for me, certainly law enforcement and emergency management is what I do. So really trying to keep those relationships up with our cross-border law enforcement and with our cross-border emergency managers. As you know, when we had the tragic floods just a few years ago, our partners in Canada was affected also. And being able to ensure that the plans that we have in place, the work that we've already built upon, that we don't lose that. So for me, it's just ensuring that we keep those relationships and we keep, the residents of Whatcom County safe, but also ensure that those relationships aren't lost, because we really can't do what we need to do without them.
It was interesting, Laurie, you mentioned, and I saw this in your book too, that talking about the politicization of the border as a political tool that we kind of saw come into play during COVID. And Ted, you've commented on this too, saying that really that represents a failure in two nations working together when you have to put strict border controls on. It's a failure where it should be easy, and it's not in the best interest of public health at that time to necessarily do what the changes were made on the border. So I wonder if that foreshadows where we are today, and in what way, I guess, maybe this is a question for you, Laurie, in terms of there's a precedent now that that's been done. And it hasn't all been done from our side of the border, right? I mean, the Canadians seems like have done a fair bit of that themselves. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's multiple ways to answer this question. One would be that maybe COVID was one of the first times that the Canadians were actually more keen to restrict the border than Americans. I mean, Canadians, if you look at the population distribution, if you look at the trade dependency, there's a lot of connection to the United States versus, I think many people in the US away from border communities aren't normally thinking about the Canadian relationship, which is probably playing out today. But that was maybe a little bit of a shift, and I think it also highlighted the fact that our countries were they approached the pandemic very differently, and there was a lot of skepticism about the US approach at the time. So maybe a little bit of a crack in that relationship of trust, and that played out at the border because we really didn't collaborate on those restrictions. We approached them differently. We failed to sort of move forward together once we implemented them. And yeah, I think, and Ted can sort of pick up where I'll leave off, but I think that laid the groundwork for some of the sort of knee-jerk reaction we see in the use of borders, particularly now in the United States. But I would not be surprised if we start to see a little bit more of that restriction or thickening of the border from the Canadian side any day now.
I mean, the only thing I would add, Ron, the first book I wrote was about borders after 9/11, because there were a lot of restrictions, not on the scale we saw during COVID, but there were significant restrictions following 9/11, and there was a lot of concern in the United States about the possibility of people coming across the Canadian border with the intention of carrying out terrorist attacks. I mean, one of the famous cases, the Millennium Bomber, Ahmed Rassam, had tried to cross in Port Angeles en route to Los Angeles Airport to bomb the airport, and was intercepted by customs officials in Port Angeles. So there's a history in this region too. And immediately after 9/11, the US effectively closed the border for a couple of days. There was intensive inspections. And the two governments basically immediately said, no, this is not good. We can't have this kind of disruption. And they sat down and negotiated a sophisticated collaborative program for trying to improve security at the border while maintaining lawful trade and travel, even improving it if possible. So the contrast between the post 9/11 approach and what we saw under COVID was striking. And I think what we've seen is this gradual move away from collaborative responses to unilateral responses. More of it driven from the US side, but certainly not all of it driven from the US side.
And at the time, both of those incidents were surprise events, right? In a large sense, people had to scramble. This time, you get the sense from watching, at least I do, Canadian officials like, okay, we know Donald Trump a little bit, unfortunately, and they're kind of prepared for it. And you could tell some of the responses that rolled out, in Ontario and other places seemed like prepared, right?
So just one quick thing, and we want to move on. They were not prepared, I think, for the linkage of tariffs and borders. Okay. The notion that the United States would put tariffs in place unless Canada did more to stop the tiny shipments of fentanyl coming off from Canada or the relatively small numbers of unauthorized migrants, that was new. Trump never talked about that in the campaign. I don't think the Canadians were prepared for that at all.
Yeah.
fentanyl is a big issue in DC, at least the motivation, the leverage for the tariffs, right? I mean, Tank, maybe you can speak to that in terms of the fentanyl problem in Whatcom County was bad like everywhere else here still is last year. Do you guys have a sense of the border being a contributor to that problem?
Well, we certainly know that most of the fentanyl that we've had in Whatcom County and some of the arrests we've made and large arrests, that those drugs were tracked from the Seattle area and south of Seattle. So the notion that we're seeing tons of drugs come through the Canadian border southward, that's not what we're seeing. It's mostly coming south to north. At least that's the drugs that we have intercepted. So we're still working hard to stop drugs either way, whether it's coming north or south. But generally, for us in Whatcom County, it's coming south, and it's a lot. It's coming from the south, and it's a lot.
Can I throw in a funny stat? Just quickly. This is for the northern border as a whole. First 2 months of this year, fentanyl seizures are down 34%, but egg seizures are up 116%.
Yeah, and following up on that, the news of the week, I was just going to say, that blew me away for a second. I have to clear my mind.
The eggs are a lot cheaper.
At our event next month, we are going to have a live in a silent auction, and one of the auction items will be 3 dozen eggs. Lyndon, and the tag is going to say estimated value priceless. So save your pennies for that. Law enforcement, obviously, the sheriff and Dean and I and some reporters talked about this before the sheriff's election when you were a candidate. And one of the issues that was presented to us from our readers was the degree of cooperation between Whatcom County law authorities and law enforcement officials and federal agents, of which we have many, 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 many in Whatcom County. I'd like to know exactly how many. If anyone knows, I'd appreciate seeing that paperwork. They are very, very visible, and they are more so visible today. Our news operation has kind of been turned on its head in the last couple of weeks following rumors about certain things happening, some of which have and some of which haven't. So maybe both of you could talk about that issue. I know there are protocols in place in the Sheriff's Department for that. And could you give us an overview of what you see your role is in those situations, if any, and controlling public unrest that might result from those actions by ICE and Border Patrol?
Sure. So I really want to talk about when we say agreements, that it depends on what type of agreements that we're talking about. Because we certainly work with our federal partners day in and day out on criminal cases. But what we don't do is work with our federal partners with any type of immigration cases or cases involving someone that might be a migrant that might be here illegally or otherwise. So in May of 2019, was a law passed here in Washington. It's called the Keep Washington Working Act. And that act specifically details what state and local law enforcement can and cannot do in terms of our interactions with our federal partners around immigration control, immigration apprehension, and those type of things. In fact, Aaron and I was talking about it today. And the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs put out a notification in February about exactly what we can and cannot do in Washington State. Maybe 6 weeks ago, I put out a letter to the editors, to all the local newspapers, talking about the policies and procedures with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. Those policies and procedures hasn't changed since 2019. So what I put out isn't something new. And essentially, what it says is that the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office, and really any other state and local law enforcement, for that matter, by law, that we cannot assist in the apprehension of any immigration-related case. However, if there was a situation where the federal authorities were in our jurisdiction, we can't impede or hinder what they're doing either. So we are state and local law enforcement officers, and we're trained to enforce state laws and not federal laws. But when you talk about agreements, I just want to be clear that we do work with our federal partners on criminal cases, not any type of civil immigration cases. Go ahead, Aaron.
Maybe I'll just build off that to say I think the line that the sheriff drew there is the one that Keep Washington Working draws. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the law requires, but I think first I want to explain why do we have Keep Washington Working. This is the law that the sheriff is talking about that here. And Keep Washington Working exists so that people in the community feel safe and comfortable in reaching out to the sheriff's office in the first place, right? If you're a non-citizen who's here maybe without authorization or even with authorization, and you have maybe family members that don't have authorization or otherwise, reaching out to law enforcement can be a fearful enterprise if what you think is going to result is the removal of yourself or your family member or detention in the facility in Tacoma. And that's why I think, or that's exactly why the law exists, so that actually our communities are safer because the large number of immigrants that live here feel empowered to reach out so that the sheriff's office can do its work when in fact they reach out. And I think the sheriff's statement a few weeks ago explained that, but I think it's something that I haven't always seen appreciated, and it's why that law exists in the first place. And that line between criminal and civil enforcement is what the law effectively draws. So local law enforcement in Washington isn't allowed to inquire into somebody's immigration status. If somebody is detained, they're not allowed to tell, for example, ICE or the Border Patrol, hey, we're about to release this person. That sort of thing is what the law covers and ensures that there's not that sort of cooperation. Now, like the sheriff said, there's task forces, for example, between sheriff's office or local law enforcement to investigate certain crimes, or historically, the part of immigration customs enforcement called Homeland and Security Investigations is a branch of ICE that investigates crimes like trafficking, et cetera. And that kind of collaboration makes sense, right? But the kind that Keep Washington Working tries to limit is that endangers community members from ending up in the removal process and preventing them from wanting to reach out to law enforcement in the first place.
I also like to add that one thing that's concerning for me right now is that just naturally, when it comes to victimization of a crime, that many crimes are unreported every day. And not just in the community that we're talking about, but all communities. And with the tone that we have now, my worry is that there are going to be multiple incidents or victims that will not report crimes to us because they're fearful. And oftentimes those crimes involve, unfortunately, some type of domestic violence. And what we know about domestic violence is that if there isn't some type of intervention, it never gets better. So just having those increase of non-reported crimes and an increase of victimization is a big concern for me.
Is there anything you can do about that in terms of, what do you tell your deputies? You obviously can't intervene in the situation until you get a report. So you're talking about fear of even reporting a crime in the first place.
Correct. So it's the fear of reporting the crime. It's the fear of calling 911.
Right.
Right? It's the fear of telling a neighbor who might call 911. It's a fear of if you walk to a store and you think you may be able to report it, do you want to do that? Most people in a certain situation wouldn't do it because they might be fearful that they might be removed.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I think that sort of affirmative communication to the community is actually what is particularly needed in this moment, because people are scared in a way that they have, I think, even compared to the first Trump administration, never been, because of the very visible arrests that have been occurring in this state and throughout the country, right? And so affirmatively communicating that you're reaching out to law enforcement because of a domestic violence incident or because your home has been burglarized isn't going to result in your removal. I think something that is really important, and I do want to commend, because it's not what is happening in all of the state by any means. Some are silent. Some parts of the state, there are sheriffs who, in fact, are actively making known that they intend to collaborate with ICE. And I think that is actually a betrayal of their oath of office, because they are to keep the community safe. And what they're actually doing is not doing that. They're doing precisely the opposite and violating state law to boot when they're nominally charged with enforcing that law. So I really appreciate that affirmative communication, because I think it's particularly needed in this moment.
Sheriff Tanksley, you said you have, obviously existing relationships with federal law enforcement for a lot of reasons. Have you seen those relationships change, or the direction or cooperation you're getting from the federal government change in the last 3 months at all?
I have not, and in fact, earlier I talked about the relationships, and for me, with our federal partners here in Whatcom County, the people that are in charge of those agencies, and I know for Border Patrol, their chief has been here about 2 years, and the port about 1.5 years, and I meet with them maybe every 6 months. But when they first got here, we met and talked, and I brought a copy of the Keep Watching Working Act, and just to, from the onset, have that understanding, and certainly haven't had any pushback, and we still have a good relationship. And it's about knowing their role and our role, and where those roles don't cross, and the actual space that they can cross. So I haven't had any pushback.
Okay, that's interesting. Have you had a circumstance since you're in your tenure here, where you have had a request from federal authorities to assist with something that you've had to say no to?
I have not. And it's always interesting, because I think the reason why I haven't had to do that is because we've already had that conversation.
Right.
Right. And if we hadn't had those conversations, then perhaps they would. And even in the last few weeks, those conversations are ongoing. And it's important for us to understand each other. And so there isn't any miscommunication. And I'm not going to violate the law. And my deputies won't either. So again, like I said earlier, that we cannot assist, but we cannot hinder either. So having that understanding.
I think one point on that too is it doesn't shock me, for example, that federal law enforcement officers aren't asking, say, that a person in the county jail be detained after the time they would otherwise be released for a pickup or something like that, because perhaps they know that there's not going to be, that request isn't going to be honored here. in other parts of the state where those requests are honored, those kind of requests do happen, irrespective of what state law requires. So I think that it's true that at times federal law enforcement officers know who to ask, essentially, right? And that dictates how they act in trying to figure out how to arrest somebody.
But I will say, in the last few months, we've had to internally review our policies and to give reminders, not only on the patrol side, but on the correction side too. Because, not saying that it would happen, but if we're presented with some type of legal document at 2 o'clock in the morning, we need to make sure that it's a legal document. And we haven't had that, but it's important to make sure that our team is trained up and we're not inadvertently violating the law.
There's some degree, just from a public safety standpoint, where it seems like you should be notified of certain things, right? Like if the federal government wants to land a C-130 at BLI and dump out a bunch of equipment and spread people all over the streets, are you gonna know about that? Or is it just gonna happen and you're gonna hear about it organically?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Ron. Well, if I had any intelligence information, I can tell you that.
I was told you were in the chat group last week.
No,
Is that not true?
I use WhatsApp.
Right.
He's just upset he didn't get invited to.
So generally, no, I'm not going to be advised of that. And it's good reason for it. Mm-hmm. And again, I talked about those boundaries, and I think they want to respect those boundaries as well. Now, with regard to even the Keep Washington Working Act does talk about, actually our policy does talk about responding to literally like emergencies of physical harm, and things like that. So we can respond to emergencies like that, but as far as like, getting a briefing or something like that, that's not our role.
Okay. I want to shift a little bit and talk about the economy. Your bailiwick. How bad is this going to get for the local economy if we continue on this path where border restrictions get tighter both ways, the numbers that we're seeing go down? And by the way, I'm curious about what numbers you're seeing of how far the border crossing numbers have gone down in recent weeks, and what does that portend?
So in the last 3 weeks, if we look at Blaine, Linden, and Sumas combined, we've seen a decrease of about 40% in Canadian vehicles, about 65,000 vehicles, and very rough preliminary estimate would be that's about 100,000 visits in 3 weeks. Wow. And that's higher than the month before. So it's dropping more and more. Right now it's early days, it's low visitor season. This tends to be the sort of January, February quiet time of the year for border crossings. So the impact of the economy, I think to answer that, it's a little bit of a wait and see. What happens in the spring, what happens in the summer. But there's been a lot of reports, some of which have come out of Cascadia and some other sources talking about businesses that are closing. There was a piece up in Blaine where some business owners estimated their business was down 60%. Mm-hmm. We know that the hospitality sector in Bellingham and / sort of Northwest Washington in February was down 12%. So, the numbers are all negative and they're all dropping. And in terms of the impact on the economy, we did some of this analysis during COVID because we were looking at an unprecedented time and the disruption to the flow of people across the border. And so we looked at where Canadians shop, how much money they tend to spend, what their impact can be on our retail sales. It touches many parts of our economy, real estate as well. And what we saw during COVID was kind of an anomaly where, yes, we had much fewer people crossing, but we had a lot more domestic spending. We had a lot of people staying home and buying a lot of stuff. So our retail sales tax didn't really take a hit. We saw a lot of rubber tire tourism, people coming up from Seattle instead of going abroad because they couldn't travel abroad easily. And we also saw a lot of people moving to Bellingham, right? We saw population growth. We saw an increase in our housing costs and in our demand for housing. So I think there's lessons we can learn from the experience during COVID, but we're in a very different situation because I don't think those kind of buffer effects are going to fill in the gaps so much. Some of the businesses that rely on Canadian shoppers will weather that storm just fine. Businesses like Ross and, Trader Joe's and Costco, they have the ability to endure a dip, even if it's a sort of a longer term dip, but the smaller businesses don't. So it's going to be those smaller businesses, and particularly in places like Blaine, especially, and of course Point Roberts as well. Something we were talking about a little bit backstage is that many of these communities were kind of just recovering from the COVID border closures. They were just sort of welcoming back the same number of Canadian travelers. If we look at the graph, there was a huge drop off during COVID, and then it shot back up and it was continuing to climb. And those of us who look at the numbers, who study this, we're kind of looking at, okay, 2025 is going to be the return to normal, and we can kind of understand what that economic impact is now. And we're still prepared to do those studies, but it's certainly not going to be sort of a new normal and a new baseline. So I think, to wrap it all up, it's still very unpredictable. It's still early days, but we're already seeing some pretty significant impacts just 100 days in, right?
Two other quick things I'd add to that. Consumer prices are going to go up. I mean, we have auto dealerships all over Bellingham. My wife and I both drive Subarus from the local Subaru dealer. Well, as of April 2nd, those cars are coming from Japan. They're going to be hit with 25% tariffs. So the prices, the costs of those dealerships are going to go up significantly by thousands of dollars. So you're going to see a slowdown in retail sales due to rising prices as a result of the tariffs on imports. We're not a major manufacturing center, but we have a healthy shipbuilding business, for example. I haven't parsed that. You guys could probably do that. I would guarantee they're bringing in a lot of imported parts. The cost of those is all going to go up, which is going to slow down that business. And then to the extent that, as you say, Laurie, the Seattle area provided a buffer last time, manufacturing, the whole Boeing ecosystem is going to be hit very hard by tariffs as well. So there'll be less money in those communities to be spent up here. So I think we'll get it from both directions, not just from the loss of Canadian shoppers, but a lot of other things that are going to hit this community as well.
What about agriculture? Is that something that we're going to have to wait and see? I mean, obviously there's a double problem, right? You have the commodities issue and labor issues too. Seems like that would be very much in peril.
I think, generally speaking, well, no, I wouldn't even say that as a job. I was thinking about the sectors that are targeted, but when other countries retaliate against the United States, they tend to retaliate heavily in agriculture. If they're strategic about it, which they often are, they go more after the big commodity crops that are coming from the red states. We produce a lot of specialty fruits and vegetables that aren't usually on the front line of retaliation, but this time around they well could be. I mean, we don't have as many apples here in Whatcom County, but the apple industry statewide. Almost certainly on April 2nd, we're going to hit India with big tariffs because the president is talking about reciprocal tariffs. India has some of the highest tariffs of any major economy in the world. Last time in the first Trump administration, we hit India with tariffs. They responded by doubling the tariffs on apples, and Washington State lost all of its apple exports basically to India, which is a couple $100 million market. So I think it's quite possible that Washington State agriculture really gets targeted. Wine's already getting hit. I mean, you're seeing this in the Canadian liquor stores. They've pulled a lot of American alcohol off the shelf. Some places have tried to distinguish between sort of red state products like bourbon from Kentucky and blue state products like wine from California and Washington State. Right. But I think as this goes on, that's going to get thrown out the window. And the Canadians either won't sell wine from Washington State or they won't buy wine from Washington State. So agriculture is going to take a hit too, for sure.
It's all really bumming me out here.
Yeah, no, this is bad stuff.
Sorry.
Bad stuff. There's not a silver lining here at the moment.
What are some other things that we love and cherish that are going to go up in flames?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
So, I'm not on comments, but I think one concerning part about the emphasis on, at this point, removing anyone is the potential for labor shortages in the agriculture industry too, because so much of that has historically, including here, relied on often undocumented labor, right? And that labor supply is likely to be constrained, I think, as more people are detained and deported, which I think at this point it's clear that's happening in our experience at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. We're definitely seeing an uptick of people who are maybe longer time residents but don't have status here and work in those kinds of industries where there's a heavy reliance on folks without status. So I think that too is another aspect of that puzzle of rising prices that's likely to contribute to them because of pressures on labor.
And just to show you how complex all this stuff is and how I think the administration has no idea what the cumulative impacts of its measures are going to be. But if you look at the tulip industry in Skagit County around Mount Vernon, is that agriculture, is that tourism? I think it's primarily tourism, right? It's a huge tourist event. People come from all over the world. To the extent that it's getting a lot harder to come to the United States, the administration's about to put a travel ban in place on 43 countries. There have been enough stories about detentions. People are scared of traveling to the United States. That's going to take a bite out of the annual tulip festival, which is a huge revenue earner for that region. So there's a lot of different pieces that connect up in different ways.
They don't know the pieces and apparently don't care. Right.
One thing I forgot to mention on the economics is also the airport. So the Bellingham Airport typically is around 60% Canadians. And they don't quite have the numbers yet, but what the port told me was a drastic decline in Canadians, and they based that off of the parking lot, looking around at how many Canadian cars are in the parking lot. So, but that's a really important one for us here, those of us who like to be able to fly in and out of Bellingham. It almost feels like a luxury, but if we have even a 30-40% decline, those connections and those routes may get squeezed as well.
So long story short, good for parking.
Good for shopping, maybe.
Bad for just about everything else.
You're the journalist here, Ron. How can you be the optimistic guy?
I'm an incurable optimist, or I wouldn't be here. There's always a little shining light to everything, right? Trader Joe's. But I'm curious what you think, Ted, about the tariff game. And of course, if you knew the answer to this question, you'd be rich. But where do you think the tariff thing is going? Is this going to continue to be this daily up, down, tariff, on, off? Can that continue? Will the economic forces in this country allow that to continue? Can they do something about it? Where's it going to go?
Yeah, this is the $24,000 question. Just the short version is there's a reason the founders gave Congress the power over foreign commerce, because it creates a certain sort of predictability. As you all know, Congress isn't great at getting things done. And so if you have a set of rules around tariffs, they're hard to change. And so that's predictable both for US businesses that import and for countries that export to the United States. What President Trump has done is to pull on a whole bunch of powers delegated over pretty much the last century by Congress, intended to be used for extreme situations, and stretch them to the breaking point. There is now, for instance, a national security investigation into Canadian lumber exports, that somehow this threatens our national security. And that provides grounds under a 1962 law to put tariffs in place on Canadian lumber. So Trump is essentially making up the legal rationale for this stuff. And so what we are really seeing is kind of Donald Trump's id. He loves tariffs. He's loved tariffs his whole life. Like, you go back, I've researched his writings and speeches on this stuff going back into the 1980s. He thinks tariffs are great. And there's no constraints on him right now. So the question is, what are the constraints? Well, the markets maybe, if the markets go sour enough, but he's already trying to hedge against that. Say, well, may get worse for a while, but it'll get better. Business is cowed, right? Even the industries that are getting hurt by this are pretty reluctant to speak openly about it. Mostly they're crawling to the White House and trying to make special deals. Say, give us a break on this or that. Retaliation from other countries? I don't think that probably does it. So I don't see exactly where the restraints are. The courts maybe, but a lot of these laws that give the president this flexibility have international emergency ties. The law that he's threatening to use against Canada and Mexico and the connection to fentanyl and unauthorized migration is the International Economic Emergencies Powers Act that goes back to the 1970s. Well, courts tend to defer to presidents when they say, this is an emergency. So we don't really know how the courts are going to deal with this. So this is part of the problem. I think if I had to put my money down, I'd say for some significant period of time, we are going to see this back and forth with the president saying we're going to do this big thing, and then people pleading to the White House or to the Commerce Secretary, and there'll be some little clawback because it would completely destroy an industry if it was done the way the president wanted to do it. So I think we're going to see this back and forth for a long time, and I think it's going to be very destabilizing for our economy and the economies of our neighbors as well and others around the world.
That was the fear, is that there's really no plan there. It's just like, oh.
Well, I mean, there is.
Is there a plan?
There's some makings. The extent that there's a plan. Plan one is to try to encourage companies to relocate production to the United States, invest here rather than in Canada or Mexico or Europe or Asia. A lot of that's very long term, though. You know, building an auto plant, takes you 3 or 4 years, right? You don't do that overnight. So even if that's the longer term result, and Trump would favor that, it's a lot of short term costs. The other piece that's hard to predict is revenue. I mean, if you go back before the creation of the income tax in 1913, tariff revenue was a big part of the federal government's revenue. Trump wants to both extend the very expensive tax cut that got passed in his first term and do deeper cuts. And he's going to need revenue to offset that. So in the past, under other presidents, tariffs were always a negotiating tool. You threaten other countries and they do things in response, normally lower their tariffs. There are reasons to think that Trump actually wants many of these to stay in place to raise revenue for the government. And that's very new. We have not seen that in again, I would say, close to a century.
He's thinking well ahead into the third term.
Let's not go.
Pretty quickly.
Yeah, really.
I want to take the chance of sitting next to two prominent academics. There's a lot of turmoil in academia also, including here on our own campuses. Do you, as people who research Canadian issues, and we've seen targeted sort of attacks on different subjects, fear for your ability to do future research about these questions at all?
No.
No?
I don't. I think maybe that's naive, but I feel that Western very much supports interrogating the things that are being done. I think Washington State and the community is also on the side of those of us who are trying to advocate for what we think is wrong. So I feel fine speaking out. Now, the extent to which that Canadian collaboration becomes more difficult is what I'm absolutely most worried about. A lot of my grant funding comes from the Canadian government, and I don't know if that's going to continue. I don't know that my Canadian colleagues will be coming to the US anytime soon. So it's going to require probably more new and creative ways of continuing to try to bridge that border. And probably facing a lot of anti-American sentiment, even though this is not actions that I support in any way, shape, or form.
I mean, we're a little more insulated, I think, in the social sciences because there isn't quite the same reliance on federal funding. Where they've been going after is using federal money for scientific research. That was the club they used against Columbia. They've been using it against the University of Washington. Western Washington is not as big a research university, so I think we're not quite as vulnerable on that front. But that's a real threat for the academic community more broadly, because the federal government is an extremely important funder of research in the natural and applied sciences.
It seems like the dominant theme that I see of all these things in the newsroom is that people are fearful. Obviously, immigrants are fearful, whether they're documented immigrants or not documented immigrants. People seem fearful. Their neighbors are fearful because they're their neighbors, right? And there's a very, I feel, and I wrote about this maybe not very effectively recently, about sense of community, I think, that might be unique. And Laurie, maybe you could speak to this too, or maybe Aaron, between BC and Northwest Washington, literal family connections across the border, sense of loss, it feels like. And I'm curious if there are things that ordinary citizens like the folks in this room can do to help with that. I mean, one thing I suggested, and I'm looking at doing as a journalist, is reaching out to our colleagues across the border. We were talking about this earlier. There are a lot of people there that think like we do, and we'd like to connect with them and share material. It really helps for people to know what's happening just across this arbitrary line. And Tank was mentioning earlier, listening to a Canadian radio station every day and getting a really unique perspective on what's happening there. So anybody want to talk about that? Like, what are some of the things that we can do to try to preserve those connections through this storm, which hopefully will come and go at some point?
You guys want to jump in? I mean, I go back and forth on sort of what the bar should be. You know, there's this sentiment early on, oh, we should tell our Canadian friends that they're still welcome to come to Bellingham, they're still welcome to Whatcom County, and we'd still love for them to spend their money here, and I think that's become a very tone-deaf message. It's incredibly important for Canadians to spend money in their own economy because their economy is gonna really need all the support it can get with what it's facing. I've been in some community forums. One was actually the San Juan Economic Development Alliance and their counterparts in the Gulf Islands, and it was just sort of a closed-door online forum around people that want to continue to work together on shared challenges. So I think maybe the shared challenges component is the most productive. You mentioned the flooding. I mean, things that we have to work together on in order for them to be successful, and that will bring benefits to both sides. I think that's really important. You know, we have the World Cup games coming to Seattle and Vancouver. I've been involved in a lot of different conversations around how do we make sure people, I mean, again, a little tone deaf now, but get it back and forth across the border easily and not get stuck when they're trying to attend games in both cities. That collaboration may change, but it's still really important for us to work together so that those benefits can accrue to both sides. So it's, in my opinion, sort of small wins, shared challenges, and then it probably doesn't hurt to make sure that our neighbors do know that we support them, we don't support the policies that are being put in place, and little shows of that like the Peace Arch gatherings that are happening here and there, just to say, hey, we're here for you, and we'll come to Canada to see you, and we'll shop on the north side of the border to show that support.
And I don't think it hurts to write letters to your members of Congress, even though they're, our members are largely sympathetic. Doesn't hurt to leave phone messages at the White House. The political grassroots stuff. I mean, you talk about the constraining factor. If there's anything that concerns Donald Trump right now, it's that in Pennsylvania, the Republicans lost a state Senate seat that they had basically never lost before. I mean, and literally the next day, that was yesterday, and today, Elise Stefanik, who was going to be our ambassador to the United Nations, was pulled back because they're scared they might lose her seat in Florida in a by-election. So at the end of the day, I think the political power, if you want to get a message and put some kind of distance between the Republicans in Congress and the president, that's how you do it. It's through election. There are by-elections coming up. So political activity, I mean, I think, a lot of us after the last election are a little burned out, but I don't think it's the time to be burned out.
It would be a good time to take a short break on that note. So we've had a number of questions from the audience through the Slido program. I really appreciate that. Many of the questions that were asked early on have been answered in the course of the discussion, but we still have some others. But before I get to those, I wanted to ask Ron a question. How's the media doing in covering all this? Not to put you on the spot.
You mean locally or globally?
Both.
Both. Well, it's interesting because I was just having a conversation in the newsroom today about the slide that television news has taken even further into a hole. It was a low bar to start with, and now it's just crazy to see the stuff that comes on TV. We have a TV in our office that stays on. It's right above Alana's desk, unfortunately, I'm sorry. And we watch the crawler, and it's Trump announces, breaking, Trump announces, and we just go, oh God. And it's really changed the way that we do business at CDN, honestly. It's kind of turned everything upside down. We had the best laid plans of a lot of enterprise things we want to work on in the coming year. And not surprisingly, we've now shifted gears into reactive mode like many other people. Our immediate reaction to the first things that came out of Washington after the Trump election was really to focus intensely on local news. And we hear from our readers and a lot of you folks that that's what you want. And it's a way that you can see what's going on here where people are trying to make a difference and it's within your grasp, right? It's not something out of your control. And I think as humans, we all kind of look to those things. So we try to focus on the local news. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the local news is reactions to what is happening in Washington. So, we are not going to ignore that. It's the most important story often in town in many ways. When someone's arrested or detained. Like yesterday, that's our story. It's in our backyard. We care about it. We're going to cover it. We're down there tonight. So that's a big mission for us, is to cover local human impact of all this stuff and document it. I think as journalists, we sometimes shift into the role of historians, and we need to do that more often. We did that on election night. We sent our entire staff out to Whatcom and Cascadia counties everywhere, and I said, this is going to be a moment in history, for better or worse, that's going to change history in a way that probably more profoundly than most of anything else that's happened in many of our lifetimes. And we have people in our newsroom who are in their mid-20s to my age, which is a big spread, right? Which is one of the great things about our newsroom. And everybody agreed and got into that and went out and just showed what was happening that night when these election results started to come in, and talked to people about why did you vote that way you did. And I think we learned a lot about a lot of people about how they perceived the choice, right? And we documented that moment. And I see our role now is to do that with whatever happens with to our community. That's our job. You know, we're part of the community, so we'll refocus a lot of our efforts. It doesn't mean we'll stop doing the things that we already did. It means we'll just do more. And that's our approach. I don't know what everyone else's approach is. The national media seems to be spinning in circles about how to cover this story, and it's working for the people who are doing this on purpose, I think, every day. There are multiple announcements about things that are possibly very profound, and I can relate to the problems of assignment editors everywhere, because do you take that seriously? Do you send 3 people out to do a story about Trump pronouncement A, and the next day it's gone like it never happened? Oh, changed my mind, right? So we're trying to be judicious about what we cover, and we hear a lot of things, and our role is as fact checkers and, you know, sorting out the best version of the truth that we can get to, as Bob Woodward would say. But I think in general, there's been a lot of really good national reporting, and so people have risen that you didn't expect. Wired magazine, you know, covered the Doge thing really, really effectively. And people are canceling their subscriptions to the Washington Post. I canceled our syndicate subscription. In a way that was reflective of the fact that I feel like people don't really care what columnists in Washington, D.C. are saying about Trump. They want to hear more about what's happening here. So we're publishing more guest commentaries from local folks, doubling the numbers of those. And believe me, one of the most interesting things that's happened in our newsroom in the last 3 years is the amount of flow of opinion from all you folks has probably quadrupled in the last 4 months. I'm not kidding. It's remarkable, and I think that is super encouraging, because it's an outlet that we encourage. We want to hear voices of all of you about what's happening, and I'm especially looking for voices of people who are just citizens and have an opinion and have the courage to say something about what's happening to their neighbors. So don't hesitate to do that. It's really been a unique experience. I told our staff at the staff meeting last week, there's probably never been a more difficult time to be a journalist, or a more important time. So all of our folks are with that.
We've had many questions, basically along the lines of, okay, what can I do? And particularly people who are concerned about, sympathetic to the rights of immigrants, maybe outraged by what they see that ICE is doing. So a question for Aaron, how can people help?
I think that there's several ways that people can help. Is my mic on at the moment? It doesn't sound like it. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. I think there's several ways. The first one may not be the one that folks want to hear, but it is truly the case that there are lots of organizations doing really good work that are facing funding cuts right now because of things like Doge, but also because there's a coordinated effort to deprive people of legal representation while at the same time making it a lot difficult to obtain routes to legal status in the United States. So just this past week, for example, the administration has basically cut off funding to represent unaccompanied youth in their cases. These are quite literally often teenagers or even younger who are sometimes in removal proceedings or have entered the country and gone through basically government-run shelters because they've fled their countries of origin. And the administration has, at the same time as making it more difficult for those, started to target those children for removal, cut off basically the funding for them to obtain representation. That's, I think, immoral and pernicious. But unfortunately, a lot of organizations depend on the federal government's funding, including an organization like the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project has seen already funding cuts because of that. So it's true that giving in order to sustain that kind of work is really important. Related to that is, state and local funding is also actually really important for defending against the rights of, or defending folks against removal and ensuring that their rights are protected. So, with budget constraints at the state, and often, the city of Seattle too, I know is facing lots of budget constraints, advocating that those sources of funding remain because of the moment we face, I think is another really important thing. And so calling your local representatives, your state senators, et cetera, is really critical right now. I think there's other things too for folks who are wanting to help, and that's there's something called the Fair Fight Bond Fund, which helps if oftentimes folks have a chance to go before, I shouldn't say oftentimes, a limited number of people, unfortunately, have a chance to go before an immigration judge and say, I'm not a flight risk, or I'm not a danger to the community, and I should be released, just like in criminal proceedings, right? And the judge will say, yeah, I agree with you, and it's set a bond at a certain amount. And folks often can't afford that amount. It's not like criminal proceedings where you can go to a bonds person and ask for help. You have to pay the full amount. And so bond funds like that help people to be able to exit the detention center, return to their communities, their families, their jobs, et cetera, and have a better chance to defend against their removal cases. So I think the unfortunate truth is there's lots of things that need financial help, but advocating for at the local and state level that those funding sources that are helping defend people are maintained is another really critical thing I think people can do right now.
Sorry, go ahead.
If you are an attorney, there is an incredible need to, and there are sometimes cases that are easier, even if you don't have experience. We have a long list that in which the cases are never taken, of opportunities for people to volunteer their services. One other thing is if you speak a foreign language, especially if it's not Spanish, because a lot of our staff already speak Spanish, that's uncommon. You can help with translation, things like that. So I think those are two other tangible ways if you have certain skill sets that are needed right now.
How has your workload changed? And I suspect it has increased quite dramatically.
It definitely.
Since January 20th.
Yes, I've been a lot busier since January 20. We've filed a lot of new lawsuits. The administration has made, as was discussed earlier, emergencies out of everything. That phenomenon that's occurring of invoking emergency authorities to unlock certain powers with respect to the economy is also being used in the immigration context to unlock certain powers with respect to use of the military or to try to rapidly deport people without the normal process and rights that the immigration laws afford. So I think that phenomena of invoking emergency powers and trying to rapidly deport people has resulted absolutely in an uptick in our workload of trying to ensure that people's rights are respected and that they go through the process to which they're entitled.
One specific question for you, Aaron. The Tacoma ICE Center is nearing capacity. Do you know where those who are detained might be sent, and how would that affect their ability to seek representation?
Yeah, so the detention center is near capacity, which it hasn't been for several years. The numbers declined dramatically during COVID and have never basically recovered. As recently as last May, they were at 700 something, and the detention center has a capacity of 1,500, and the facility is now near full. In terms of where folks are sent, so a lot of people who are in the facility are undergoing their removal proceedings there. That means they're probably detained for 6 months to, at times, years or more in that facility while they attempt to defend against their removal. If they have what's called a final removal order, which is what you get at the end of the process if you don't obtain status, then what the government will try to do usually is deport you to the country that they say they're going to deport you. One of the, I think, worst things, or one of the most troubling things that's happened since the beginning of the Trump administration is actually its attempts to send people to countries that aren't their country of origin. You've probably read in the news about how lots of Venezuelans have been sent to El Salvador, for example. That's exactly what the government's trying to do at the moment, is they can't sometimes send people to their country of origin, so they send them to some other place, which is not their homeland, in which they may fear sometimes returning to that place because perhaps they traveled through there on the way here and because of their identity or some other reason, they were victims of serious crimes, et cetera, and so they fear returning there. Nevertheless, the government's simply deporting them there without any process. So I think that's one of the troubling things we've seen too, and it is an example of where people can be sent now sometimes in a way that they weren't necessarily in the past.
Can I just add one thing here? I do a lot of work on immigration and border issues as well. It's important to remember that what's happening right now is a fundamental denial of U.S. commitments dating back to the end of the Second World War, which is to take in people who are fleeing certain sorts of dangerous situations. Now, I mean, we could get into a long conversation about whether there's been abuse of the asylum system, but to attempt to shut it down in totality the way this administration is doing violates very old, long-standing commitments in the United States, violates laws passed by Congress. So we shouldn't normalize this stuff. We've got to deal with it. But remember that this really is a severe violation of things that our country has stood for more than 75 years.
We've had many questions noting that in this country we depend on the courts, we depend on elections, but we've seen that the administration has been somewhat cavalier in adhering to some court orders, in some cases openly defying them. So for Aaron and whoever else would like to weigh in on this, since, Aaron, one of your missions is to protect the rights of people through the courts, what happens to your clients when the administration defies or ignores those court orders? And what do we do then?
I should say I haven't yet had the experience of the government openly defying court order in one of our cases, but I think that it is true, for example, in this case that's ongoing, you've probably read in the news, in Judge Boasberg's courtroom in Washington, D.C., of the situation where the government has invoked this wartime power to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members to El Salvador. I say alleged because a lot of them claim not to be gang members, and they're the government's basis in many cases for deeming someone a member of this gang is the fact that they have a tattoo, which is not, folks get tattoos for lots of reasons, and it's not a basis to decide to send someone to indefinite detention and probably torture in an El Salvadoran prison, right? That case, I think, is a good example of the government's attempt at, or openly defying, right, a court order to return the planes back to the United States because this wartime authority had been unlawfully invoked, or folks didn't have the chance to say, hey, actually, I'm not a Venezuelan gang member. So while we haven't had it in one of our cases, I think it is a worrying trend, but I think equally worrying is the demonization of judges who side against the administration because of the erosion, I think, of rule of law that entails, right? And I think related to that, going back to the point made earlier about invoking emergency authorities, both in the immigration context and economic context, I think that's one of the things that worries me the most is the administration's willingness
to invoke very serious emergency authorities for things that the drafters of these laws would have never envisioned as a quote-unquote emergency, or even in the case of this Alien Enemies Act that we were talking about with respect to Venezuelans, laws that are clearly designed for full-on war between a foreign power and the United States. I mean, what we're talking about here is, I think, very grave and worrying invocations that threaten the civil rights of a lot of people in this country if that sort of thing is allowed to be upheld.
I might put ever so slightly more optimistic spin, because this is all getting played out in Judge Boasberg's courtroom, but I think the Trump administration is still claiming that they learned about his injunction after the plane had gone. I don't necessarily believe that, but that's their claim. So they haven't quite come yet to the point of openly defying the court order. It's a thin read, I agree. It's a very thin read. But that to me would be a step farther to say, we don't actually recognize the jurisdiction of the judge. We don't recognize the order. They're trying to challenge the whole process of injunctions, but they haven't quite crossed that line. All this can end up in the Supreme Court, and I don't know whether that's a good thing or not.
I guess the only thing I would say with respect to that is, it gets into like factual minutia, but Judge Boasberg, during his hearing, while the planes were still, I believe, within U.S. jurisdiction, had issued an oral order to turn the planes back. And the government has taken this absurd position that's not a real court order. It has to be in writing, and that's why once the planes were out, they could keep going, because there was this written order after the hearing, and that's the one they've complied with, which is, I think, absurd, and I think that is open defiance. But yeah, no, I take your point. They are trying to walk this fine line of where they're saying, oh, we're actually not defying this court order for this very technical reason that probably has no basis.
Laurie, you spoke about how you were expecting some further tightening on the border from the Canadian side. I had one specific question here. Is the Nexus program at risk?
Yeah, that's a great question.
She can't talk about that.
I don't want to lose my Nexus card.
I don't have it.
I am really concerned about the Nexus program. I'm concerned about pre-clearance. As Ted sort of outlined, in the wake of 9/11, we did some amazing things on the border. And the cool thing for us here is a lot of them actually came from this region. Like, the roots of pre-clearance are here. They were the Victoria Clipper coming across to Washington State. We have these funky legacy policies that are still operating, like pre-inspection. So if you've taken the Amtrak Cascades from Vancouver, you might wonder, why does this stop at the border? Because we didn't have this full pre-clearance process in place, which is actually, I think, any day now going to be operating out of Vancouver. And then that's been expanded to airports and places around the world. And I'll get back to Nexus, but I think whether it's Nexus or pre-clearance, there's this incredible relationship of trust that has to be present to build the fact that US and Canadian entities are sharing intelligence. They're relying on each other for that intelligence. There is a lot of cooperation and coordination going on there. And with pre-clearance, for example, you have armed US officers on Canadian soil. I mean, you can sort of see how that may start to really rub the wrong way with the Canadian public pretty quickly. And the Nexus program, I think that's probably a little bit safer. I think Canadians benefit immensely from the Nexus program. The majority of Nexus enrollees are Canadian. So I think there's probably less, that program is maybe a little less vulnerable, but even leading up to the election, there was a little bit of rumblings in the US government around, why do we have this Nexus program, and we have global entry, and we have TSA PreCheck? There was sort of this vision of rolling everything into global entry, and that was before this was even political. That was more of just sort of an efficiency perspective. So I hope Nexus doesn't go away. For those of us who rely on it here, our region is the home to the most Nexus users compared to any other region. It would really impact, how we travel, how we are able to take advantage of international flights out of YVR and vice versa. But I think it's something that, we will have to be concerned about. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you said that, Laurie, because one of the things that you said to me before in one of our interactions was how a lot of leadership on these issues have come from here in Cascadia. And You look at the people who are here right today, we have a lot of expertise here. We have a sheriff who has stood up and drawn a line at where the local law enforcement role will be. We have legal people who are very concerned about what's happening, and this region can lead the way in a lot of these things, I think, because we have the right folks here and they have the right mindset and they're determined. So that's a really cool thing for us as a place. And as far as what you can do to help, I just want to throw in any gathering in Bellingham. I've learned that the best way to endear yourself to people is to talk about pickleball. So a very nice person came up to me during the break and told the tale of having, I'll probably screw it up, but having friends playing pickleball and not wanting to come down and play pickleball anymore to support the US economy. And she said, you can stay at our house and not spend any money, right? Small thing, big impact. Pickleball could still change the world. And right? Use what tools you have. And there are a lot of very creative people in this place where we live, and that's one of the cool things about living here. And I challenge and expect all of you to apply those creative skills to some of these problems, because you can do it.
Yeah, and I just add, I mean, we do have more organizations and expertise that are focused on that Canadian sort of cross-border collaborative relationship than anywhere else along the Canada-US border. And my predecessor, Don Alper, who is a professor at Western, used to say, if we can't do it here, it's not going to be done anywhere else in terms of figuring out ways to work together. So I do think that there is a will, and there's also a lot of structures. There's research institutes, there's programs, there's several organizations that exist just to promote that cross-border collaboration. So the will is there, and it may have to look a little bit differently, but I think to be positive, we do have a lot of capacity to engage in that way.
Dawn has, Dawn has written a guest commentary for Cascadia Daily News that will appear next week on that very subject.
Okay,
So, yeah.
great.
You must have got him off the golf course. That's hard these days.
Yeah.
Sheriff Tanksley, you were very clear in describing how local law enforcement has a relationship with federal law enforcement when it comes to immigration enforcement. Have you had to reject any requests from federal law enforcement to cooperate in any immigration-related enforcement?
I haven't had to reject any. We have certainly had conversations to reinforce. And I think that's important, especially with the amount of federal law enforcement that we have in Whatcom County, and also with our local agencies. And then we also have, at least with the Sheriff's Office, new deputies as well. So I think it's important to have that conversation and to, as I said earlier, to know what we can and cannot do at 2 or 3 in the morning. And, and I keep using that because I know that there was a sheriff's office in Eastern Washington that actually rejected a document from the federal authorities to take someone out of their local jail. And I can't think of the actual sheriff's office right now, but this happened about a month ago. And that sheriff's office rejected that document to extract that person out of their jail.
And as was referred to earlier, there are some sheriffs who have resisted the Keep Washington Working Act, notably in Klickitat County. Sheriff Bob Songer have said that he's happy to work with ICE, and he and some other sheriffs have been told that they may be violating state law. They've been told that by the Attorney General. This is a real question, just how much authority do sheriffs have?
A lot of authority. However, that authority isn't limitless or boundless. So I would say if you look at what the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, it's an association here in the state of Washington, what they put out with regard to the legal bounds of not only sheriff's offices, but police departments around immigration authority and around our role, I think it's very clear what we can and can't do. Now, I cannot speak for any other sheriffs, but I can speak for myself here in Whatcom County that I'm going to follow the law, and the laws of Washington for me is not a buffet where I pick and choose which ones to enforce and which ones not to enforce. So, yeah.
Question too. So the question being like, what authorities do sheriffs have? And that all of their authority, it is broad, right? But it derives from some sort of written source, right? Like it's either the Constitution, or it's either, the sheriffs in Washington, they derive their authority, the fact that they exist, from a combination of the state constitution and state law, right? And that authority is further constrained by the rights we all enjoy, things like the Fourth Amendment, right? The Fifth Amendment, and things like Keep Washington Working and other restrictions, right? So I think it's definitely right that it's broad, but sheriffs like Sheriff Songer in Cascadia County have absurd theory. They're literally absurd about their ability to bypass or disregard state law in the name of what they think, or the authority that they think the state constitution gives them. They call themselves constitutional sheriffs. But sheriffs are bound by the law just like the rest of us. In fact, of course, as the sheriff knows, and has said here, he's obligated to enforce it, right? So it's encouraging to hear that it's not a buffet for him like it is for Sheriff Songer. And I think that's the kind of leadership we need, because it's not present in all parts of the state. And one other point I want to make there, because it was a point that related to our conversation earlier, is that the defense that some of these sheriffs make is that the request from federal law enforcement is mandatory. And that's been clearly rejected by the federal courts that govern this state. It flows easily from existing Supreme Court precedent. So the notion that they have to comply with requests from federal law enforcement does not have any basis in the Constitution. It doesn't have any basis in federal law, except for some very narrow things that we don't need to get into here. And it's contradicted by state law, which says you can't do certain things, right? And that state law is carefully crafted to ensure that it complies with the Constitution, that it complies with what federal law already exists.
Are you expecting a test case, Aaron, where the federal, because the Trump administration has said they might go after local law enforcement if they refuse to cooperate with ICE. Not encouraging them to make their test case in this county, just to be clear. Yeah. But are you expecting they're going to test it somewhere?
So they've already sued in, I think, New York and maybe Chicago over this kind of issue, basically saying you have to, saying the sanctuary laws, right, like the kind that Keep Washington Working are unlawful, right? So they're attempting to use, to make the test cases out of those. They haven't done it, I think, here on the West Coast yet, because we have existing precedent at the circuit level, so the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, that would really shut down those arguments, most likely. They wouldn't go anywhere. I think what they're trying to do is create an opportunity to try to bring something to the Supreme Court.
But also recently, the Washington State Attorney General, if I recall correctly, sued a sheriff's office, and I don't remember which one, but in terms of the threat from the administration with local law enforcement, I haven't seen anything yet, but I believe that threat is based on funding and federal grants.
Yeah, that is true.
So I've had a number of questions about the risk that immigrants are under right now. And the question is, should immigrants and even naturalized Americans, I had one question that says, as a naturalized American, can I be deported? Should immigrants and naturalized Americans be carrying their papers around with them all the time?
That's a
I definitely have friends who are in this situation who are asking themselves that same question. And I think they are drawing the conclusion that, yes, it is wise for them to carry a copy of their US passport to demonstrate their citizenship, particularly if they're people of color, because they fear what could happen otherwise currently. And I don't begrudge them or would advise them differently. So I think, it's up to each person, but I don't think it can hurt to carry a copy of your certificate of naturalization or a copy of your passport identity page to ensure that you don't end up in that situation, because that should make clear to a federal law enforcement officer that they can't detain you for immigration reasons.
Could I just add? Sorry, no, go ahead. Sure.
I'll just add, just getting back to the relationships. So as a sheriff, I have relationships with several nonprofits that help immigrants. And these relationships were not built in a day, and these relationships take time to build because you have that trust and non-trust with law enforcement. And even this week, a director of one of the organizations said, hey, I want to ask you a question. And then hours later, it's like, no, I don't want to ask you that question. And it was just interesting that the open communication suddenly is not open. And this is a person that's in charge of that organization. And so when you talk about what Aaron talked about as far as, people seeking help and should they carry their papers, and if we have leaders of organizations that had relationships with law enforcement, which is not usual, and it's hard to build, and now even those leaders are kind of taking a cautionary step back. Should I be talking to him? Who is he talking to? What does he know? So, yeah, I think it's going to be a tough time.
Just wanted to add one thing on the citizenship rights question to shamelessly turn it back to Laurie's in my book. One of the things that was striking about COVID was thank you, Ron, was in the most extreme cases faced with the COVID health emergency, there were countries that were willing to disregard citizenship rights. Australia and New Zealand are the two that are outstanding there. There were many others around the world, and in the name of a public health emergency, effectively barred their own citizens from coming home, including in the case of New Zealand, a pregnant journalist who we talked to at some length, who was barred from coming back to New Zealand to have her baby. So citizen who couldn't come home to have her baby in her own country. The Trump administration has indicated both by its actions and its words that it wants to push the envelope on who's protected. The arrest of the Columbia student, he's a green card holder, right? And they've already indicated that they're prepared under certain circumstances, claiming connections to terrorism or other national emergency situations, to strip people of green card status. There is talk in the administration of potentially going after naturalized citizens as well. So I think the protections are not as firm as they once were. And again, this is likely to be fought out in the courts. Things that I never thought we'd be discussing on a stage like this, but I think we have to take that threat seriously.
Let's go to economics for just a minute. specifically microeconomics. We've had a number of questions, just wondering, okay, how can people prepare for these tariffs? What can an ordinary person do to prepare for a trade war? I mean, should we be hurrying up and buying that car because the prices might be going up? Should we be stocking up on toilet paper because the wood pulp tariffs are going to come on? What can an ordinary person do?
If you need a new car, now's a pretty good time to buy one, quite honestly. Or buy a used car before the price goes up, because what will happen when the costs go up in new cars is the used car market will go out. It's kind of what happened during COVID because of the supply restrictions on new cars. The price of used cars went way up. So if you're thinking of a big ticket purchase, washing machine, kitchen appliances, cars, yeah, I'd go out and buy it. I seriously wouldn't wait on that. Toilet paper, probably not worth your time. But for the big ones, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to give anybody investment advice. I can't say I've done brilliantly, but I, just personally have in our retirement portfolios, I'm getting more conservative for a while because I think this stuff is gonna roil the markets. I mean, in my sort of adult life, this is the first, and we'll see where the market goes. The market's down, 8%, sort of got into correction territory for a while. This is the first market downturn that I would argue was entirely politically induced. The big market downturn sort of in my life, the dot-com crash after 2001, so that was a market, the global financial crisis, which was a banking failure. I mean, there was regulatory issues there, but it wasn't sort of directly politically caused. COVID, which was, a pandemic, a sort of natural disaster. This is the first time I can think of where actions out of Washington have precipitated that sort of market response. And we know, at least on the trade front, that there's a lot more to come. April 2nd is Tariff Liberation Day. We're all excited. So there's a lot more coming. And I don't think it's a terrible time to be a little bit cautious. But if you guys do that, then you'll come back and you'll smack me if the market goes up. And I gave you bad advice.
So a quick follow-up. What impact should we expect on real estate locally because of a trade war?
I mean, that's a hard one to answer. There's a lot of Canadian homeowners, though, in Whatcom County. Birch Bay is one example. So, I mean, to the extent that those homes start turning over and selling, I don't want to spin anything as positive in that regard, but there could be perhaps a mitigating effect on rising housing prices if a lot of people are selling and leaving. That's totally just speculation.
It's also multiple causes. It's hard to,
yeah,
we're sort of a climate refugee zone. So
that
is,
may
I think, pretty
buffer
good
out
for
with,
Bellingham real estate, despite the wildfires.
Yep.
We're not a bad place to be. So I don't know. Real estate, probably still pretty good bet.
Well, we've had a great discussion here tonight. I'd just like to take the next few minutes and just ask each of you, and I do this whenever I do an interview, I always ask this question. Is there anything that you haven't been asked about that you'd like to make sure that this audience knows? Any message you'd like to leave with us? Let's just take it one for one. Let's start with the sheriff.
Gosh, really for me, it's a lot of things, but I would say in terms of safety and security here, to actually watch out for your neighbors, watch out for any type of unusual behavior, especially if those neighbors might be from a different place or might have a different status. I would say that help people out, and I would say be generous. And if you see something, say something. And as always, I'm going to tell everyone that we're here for you, and I work for you. So if there's something you need immediately, call 911.
I had time to think about this answer and I didn't come up with something good.
I struggled.
I know. I think that's because
that was impressive.
Yeah, everything that went through my head is, and I feel like everything I've conveyed tonight is pessimism, and that's probably reflective of my current work in some way. So I think, I guess in
I would say, to add to what the sheriff said about supporting others, I think people in my organization and elsewhere do genuinely feel under attack at the moment. And I think there's a basis to feel that way between the fact that our clients have been attacked and the legal profession, and particularly immigration attorneys, are the target of executive orders effectively labeling people national security threats for representing immigrants in their removal proceedings and defending their rights, or suggesting that every claim we file is false, et cetera. So I think, ensuring that those people that you do know that are standing up for people's civil rights in this moment and supporting them is something important too. And I think I say that only because I have lately felt very depressed, I think, about the way things are. And so it's important to receive that kind of encouragement, because it feels lonely when we're drinking from a fire hose of bad information all the time.
Well, I sort of said it before, but maybe I'll just say it again, that I think our region is very unique. We've long been unique. Former Governor Christine Gregoire used to say that Washingtonians have more in common with our neighbors to the north than anybody else in another state. And I think if we can hold on to that ethos, and it might sort of be putting that relationship a little bit on life support, but I do think we have the capacity and the will to continue to strengthen those bonds through the next 4 years. And maybe I'll sort of add a personal note, building off of what you said. I also have felt really fatigued and exhausted by the constant news cycle, and it just feeling like it's getting worse and worse. And I had this moment about, I don't know, maybe a month ago, where I thought, I just want to bury my head in the sand. I just want to, if I didn't have a job but I had to read the news, like I just want to push it all away. And I got home and my daughter was watching the Lorax. And I went upstairs and I sat down next to her, and it was right at the very end of the movie. And it was right at the part where they put the Dr. Seuss quote up there that says, "Unless somebody like you cares and cares a lot, it's not going to get better." No, it's not. And then I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to put my head in the sand.
Oh man, that's a tough one to follow. You can't beat the Lorax. I might finish it at a very kind of high level, and I apologize if this doesn't work. But I often wonder about what my own politics are. In a lot of ways, I see myself as very liberal. But if you really kind of scratch the surface hard enough, I actually think I'm an Edmund Burke conservative. And Edmund Burke conservatives believe in the value of tradition, stability. They understand the complexity of human societies. We've talked a lot here about how it's hard to know what impacts these different radical policies are going to have, because it's pulling on threads that cross each other in ways we don't understand. I think, unfortunately, and this is way beyond the community here nationally, we've fallen in love with disruption, right? We think the cool kids are the people in Silicon Valley who are disrupting and changing things. I know we've got a particularly crazy one in Washington doing this. Disruption is really, really dangerous. This audience is probably mostly older like me. I can't see any of you against the lights, but we've been blessed to grow up in this era of enormous stability, a lot of which had to do with the way the United States, for better or worse, played its leadership role in the world. And a lot of the stuff we're talking about here is the United States saying, we don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to play this leadership role. We want to retreat into our own little corner here. We want to block out the world. And within our society, we want to turn things over and turf things out. Those things are dangerous. And I think we need to rediscover in whatever way we can, and in our own lives and in our voting habits and our political actions, the virtues of stability, because we're going to miss it when it's gone. I'm missing it right now. I could use a lot more stability in my life.
I've got nothing that'll touch that, so I'll leave it there.
Well, I'm glad you talked about civility, Ted, because I think that's something that we've done here tonight. we want in these forums to generate more light than heat. And I think this is something that local journalism can do. This is what local journalism should do. This is what local journalism does best. We connect people. We're members of this community just like you are. So I guess my message to you would be, keep supporting local journalism, subscribe when you can, and just remember, we're all in this together. So thanks very much for your attendance.